Hi, and welcome to the 39th installment of the Dad Project. Tonight, we're taking another look at the F-14 and my dad's time with it. If you have some extra time, watch installments 16 and 17 for my first take on my dad's stint with the Tomcat. Moreover, part of tonight's effort is to correct a mistake I made in installment 16 concerning his delivery of Tomcat number 5 to the West Coast and to expand on the public relations aspect of test flying. But before we get to the meat of the matter, let's set the stage for this installment with a little family history and a bit of world history. And before we do that, you know the drill. Let's listen to Orson Welles recite John Gillespie's High Flight.
Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God.
In 1971, as my 7th grade year at Severn School began to wane, I was told that we were moving from Annapolis and back to California. My dad had taken a job with Grumman Aerospace to fly the F-14 test program. As my summer came to an end, all that was left to do was pack up our 69 dark ivy green iridescent Mercury Cougar with its gas-guzzing big block 390 and my grandmother's 67 Marina Blue Chevy Malibu with a rather tame 2-barrel 327 for our trip back to Southern California, Thousand Oaks to be specific. My brother, sister, and I would swap back and forth between the two cars. It was August, so the Cougar with its AC was the place to be, since my Mimi's Malibu had no AC, and the upholstery was covered in plastic, like a house-proud couch swimming atop a shag carpet in Boca Raton. I loved these trips. For the most part, we stayed in one-star motels that proudly displayed their AAA-approved sign. One night would be splurged at a Holiday Inn, and we'd swim in their pool until it closed. I was always the navigator, diligently working my way through a AAA triptych that had been meticulously created and highlighted in green by a trip advisor. Each new state was celebrated as if Lewis and Clark had made yet another discovery of the already known. If we were good, or simply begged enough, we could count on a Howard Johnson's milkshake or a Stuckey's pecan long roll. Otherwise, it was PB&J's and whatever else was packed for the trip. Our exact route is buried deep in a landfill, but we did find time to visit Four Corners, Mesa Verde, and the Painted Desert. A memorable stretch for me was with my Mimi as we burned through Death Valley, our wind wings blowing blast-furnace-grade air across our bodies that were firmly glued to the plastic-covered seats. A country and western music station did its best to overcome our discomfort in hopes that the next tune would be Patsy Cline, or even better, Hank Williams. My mom, brother, and sister followed in air-conditioned splendor, and my dad, where was he? My dad saved all sorts of paperwork having to do with the different aspects of his military and civilian flying career, but who at Grumman approached him and when that was is not one of them. In his oral history for his induction as a fellow into the Society of Experimental Test Pilots, he is asked,
"What drove your decision to leave Westinghouse Electric to become a test pilot for Grumman?"
Well, it wasn't difficult at all. They called up and said, "You want to come up and fly the F-14?" How soon can I get there? That was basic. There was no big decision making going on there. It was one of those very binaural.
I may not know who called, but I do know that he started working at Grumman in July of 1971, a month before my mom, Mimi, brother, sister, and I began our journey across country. To add to the mystery, I don't know when my dad separated from Westinghouse. According to his flight logs, his last flights with Westinghouse were in August of 1970. several in an F-8 that Westinghouse used under a bailment agreement with the Navy, and the last flight on August 18th in Westinghouse's King Air. But then he wouldn't fly for 7 months before he began flying RF-8s out of Andrews Air Force Base as the instrument flight instructor pilot for Replacement Training Unit 206, VFP 306, and VFP 206, all Navy Reserve squadrons. Except for 2 weeks of active duty in any year, the typical reserve unit drills or flies 1 week in a month. But for some reason, on a cloudy, rainy Thursday, my dad found it necessary to fly a daylight unit training instrument flight from D.C. to Calverton, Long Island, home to Grumman Aerospace. The flight was on June 3, 1971, a month before he joined Grumman. That flight totally redefines the $100 hamburger. And as a side note, the RF-8G he flew, 146882, now sits in the Frontiers of Flight Museum in Dallas, Texas. Other than noting Grumman in his flight log, there is no mention of a hamburger. But a month later, he would be at Bethpage, waiting for his chance to fly the Tomcat. 1971 is now over 50 years in the rearview mirror, and fodder for historians to parse out the good, the bad, and the ugly. For my mom, as she had done several times before, it was managing our move across the country and setting up yet another household. For my Mimi, it was her turn to be with us before returning to Florida and my uncle. For my 11-year-old brother and my 12-year-old self, it was time to explore beyond our cul-de-sac before school started in search of other kids our age. My 7-year-old sister, not sure what she was doing, but her best friend, Paula Atai, was waiting to be discovered just across the cul-de-sac. While we handled the mundane chores of suburban life, the Cold War continued to percolate. Very hot in Vietnam, and to a lesser extent in other parts of the world, as the U.S. worked to hem in the Soviet Union's desire to spread their convoluted understanding of Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto throughout the rest of the world. The CIA and the KGB did their best to work their intelligence, counterintelligence gathering skills to determine what the other side was doing. Rarely did either side get it right, and as a result, the under- and overestimation of strengths and weaknesses were sincerely used to determine policy on both sides. The upshot of all this uncertainty was considerable spending on the development and acquisition of weapon systems that were ready to fight a weapon that never existed and or to counter a war that had been fought years before, as the system wended its way through a typical multi-year development cycle. The F-14 was no different and would not be immune to this folly. In the mid-50s, the Soviets perpetrated a brilliant deception during the 1955 Soviet Aviation Day. A year later, a U-2 overflight of the Soviet Union photographed a bomber base, and the CIA proceeded to perpetrate a self-inflicted deception. A formation of Soviet bombers flew over Red Square during Aviation Day, only to circle out of sight, return, and to fly over again to give the perception that the Soviets had far more bombers than they did. The deception turned several bombers into 28, and through higher math, the CIA extrapolated that the Soviets would have over 800 bombers by 1960. The CIA, with the U-2 photograph in hand, assumed that this one base was one of many, and presumed a huge bomber fleet, when in fact all the Soviet bombers were in that one base. This perceived armada of Soviet bombers would result with the U.S. Air Force countering with over 2,000 B-47s and nearly 750 B-52s to keep pace with the perceived Soviet threat, otherwise known as the bomber gap. The point is, the cost of this bomber fleet was enormous and was based on bad and incomplete intelligence. The bomber gap became an overarching military concern, and one left mostly to the U.S. Air Force to counter. The Navy's concern was Soviet bombers armed with cruise missiles that could be launched outside a carrier group's defensive shell. With that in mind, the Navy issued an RFP in 1957 for a carrier-based fleet air defense fighter, FAD, that could loiter far from its carrier. Then, on station with a powerful radar system, could launch long-range missiles that, once within a prescribed distance from the target, could activate its own radar for terminal guidance. The usual suspects would submit proposals, and it would be the Douglas F-6D Missileer that looked like a cross between the A-6 Intruder and the ill-fated Fairchild A-9 that would be contracted to move forward. Douglas's early answer to the FAD can be summed up in its name, the Missileer. It was a straight-winged, subsonic missile platform with little to no dogfighting capability. This, among other things, led to its cancellation without a flying version ever being built. However, like any good military program, the systems being developed in parallel with the airframe would continue the development process and be passed on. The engines, the TF-30, and the missiles and radar system would be inherited by the F-111 program and eventually by the Tomcat. Bendix's Eagle missile system and the Westinghouse Doppler radar system being developed for the X-6D never came to fruition, but the design parameters would live on and were successfully combined by Hughes into the Phoenix missile system, first with the F-111 and finally the F-14. The Pratt & Whitney TF-30 low-bypass turbofan engine, on the other hand, began life in the late 1950s as an engine for the Douglas Model 2067, a proposal for a 4-engine, medium-range airliner that would complement its long-range DC-8. The Model 2067, however, received very little interest from the airlines, and the project was abandoned. But the TF-30 lived on as part of the F-6D proposal that, as mentioned already, was canceled. The TF-30 then found itself chosen by General Dynamics for its entry into the TFX program that would lead to an afterburning model of that engine to be used in the F-111. So, the parameters for the Fleet Air Defense Fighter were nothing new, and several of the major systems were nothing new by the time the Tomcat was able to fulfill its role as the Fleet Air Defense Fighter. The Tomcat was the love child of the F-10F Jaguar and the F-111B, two overweight, poorly performing aircraft that managed to give birth to one beautiful, high-performance aircraft. Grumman had tried to introduce their own swing-wing fighter known as the F-10F Jaguar in the early 50s. Surprisingly, the only successful aspect of the Jaguar was the borrowed swing-wing mechanism from the Bell X-5 program, which had been cadged from an earlier Nazi design. The only test pilot to test the plane, Grumman's Corky Meyer, described it as entertaining to fly because there was so much wrong with it. And after only 32 test flights, the sole test aircraft died 1,000 deaths as a gunnery target. The F-111B, the Navy's half of the TFX program, demanded by Robert McNamara in an attempt to curtail the redundancy of Air Force and Navy aircraft programs, was a bloated beast that couldn't get out of its own way. Neither the Air Force nor the Navy was happy with the TFX program. In fact, the Navy was so unsure and unhappy with how the F-111B was progressing that in 1966 it awarded Grumman a contract to study advanced fighter designs 2 years before the F-111B was canceled. With that study in hand and their long association with the Navy, Grumman offered up an unsolicited aircraft proposal in 1967 that was very well received. But politics being what they are, the Chief of Naval Operations recommended the release of an RFP parroting Grumman's proposal in June of 1968 for what became known as the VFX program. And after nearly 10 years of machinations, RFPs, and studies, it would be the Grumman submission, the Tomcat, that was selected with all the leftover parts from 2 other unsuccessful programs, and succeeded where Dr. Frankenstein had failed. This was all background noise when my dad joined the Grumman test team. When he arrived at Calverton, he was 36 years old with several thousand hours of flight time and well trained as a test pilot, but he must have felt like a kid in a candy store. Even with a tight test schedule following the crash of the first prototype in December of 1970, my dad still needed to know the Tomcat systems inside and out before he could fly in the front seat, or even from the back. So he would spend a lot of time learning systems, studying systems, flying a simulator, getting coffee and lunch orders for the guys, volunteering for any stupid duty offered up while itching for that first flight. That itch would only last for 4 months when on October 27th he dutifully strapped himself in the rear cockpit of Tomcat No. 4 with Hal Farley at the controls. 3 days later, he would again enjoy the wonders of the Tomcat in the back seat of Tomcat No. 12 with Joe Burke at the controls, before that flight was cut short by a left engine stall. Despite the test schedule being thrown into disarray following the crash of No. 1, the testing cycle still had to move forward in an orderly fashion. The original prototype was intended for envelope expansion flights and high-speed testing. Its instrumentation was intended for that purpose and therefore different from those airframes to follow. It wouldn't be until the 12th airframe, that would be redesignated 1X, that those tasks assigned to the original prototype could be completed. So, as my dad waited for No. 5, the plane he would take to Point Magu, just down the grade from Thousand Oaks, he was flying Phantoms as a chase pilot. I had little interest in getting my driver's license as I approached my 16th birthday. There was only one thing that colored that attitude, and that was the chance to drive my dad's '57 Corvette. A week before I got my license, I watched that car being loaded on a trailer and taken away by its new owner. Other than often sitting in the passenger seat, my one time in the driver's seat was to back it out of the driveway and to park it on the cul-de-sac. Dream denied. For my dad, as he waited patiently for his turn to be checked out in the F-14, his dream would not be denied. On November 26, 1971, a blustery, typical fall day on Long Island, Hal Farley, who would later be the chief test pilot for Lockheed Martin and who would take the F-117A up for the first flight, would take number 5, 157984, up for its first flight, my dad strapped into the back seat. For 1.4 hours, they tooled around checking out systems, raising and lowering the landing gear, swinging the wings, and generally being sure all was well with this still rare bird. All proved well, and number 5 landed at Calverton. While the plane was refueled and gone over by others, Hal and my dad debriefed, had a snack, and returned to number 5 for their pre-flight. But this time, my dad would be in the front seat, only the 10th pilot to be checked out in the Tomcat. For 1.6 hours, he flew in the pattern, and he completed 12 FCLs. I'm sure if there was a tanker available, he would have had a wet plug or two to keep flying. But, as I've mentioned before, test flying is a well-choreographed evolution of events. He probably had a stack of 3x5 cards that told him exactly how each of those 12 FCLs were to be performed. From starting altitude to angle of attack to approach speed, all in the name of data collection that would define the flight parameters and capabilities of the airplane as it made its way through the testing cycle. And, as I mentioned before, they were already behind, so he, Marty LaChow, and the Grumman suits began preparing for number 5's cross-country flight 2 weeks later. Every time I sit down to write one of these installments, I learn something new, relearn something old, and occasionally misunderstand the facts. The following is one of those misunderstandings. To start with, the standard Navy flight log that my dad was using, OpNav Form 3760-31, allows just enough space for cryptic acronyms to define the facts of a flight. The remarks section seems like an afterthought, with very little space to say much more about a flight. It takes more than a cursory look to determine the finer details of a flight, and that's where I went wrong. In Installment 16, I completely misread my dad's flight log. I was sure that following his 1.6-hour first flight that he and Marty LaChow left Calverton 5 days later for a 6.3-hour cross-country flight to Point Magu. Not so. Instead, on December 1st, 1971, on his 37th birthday, he and Marty LaChow strapped into number 5 atop their Tempur-Pedic cushions to ring out number 5 for 6.3 hours in preparation for the flight to Point Magu. Not too long after I posted my first video about the F-14, I received my dad's files that contains pictures from the cross-country flight that included pictures of him and Marty being received in Dallas by local dignitaries. Why was number 5 in Dallas? What did I miss? So back to the flight logs, where it was as big as the nose on my face, 3-letter airport codes that told the tale, a cross-country dog and pony show. On December 10th, 1971, my dad, Marty, and number 5 left Calverton for a 3-hour flight to Naval Air Base Jacksonville. I have no pictures from this stop, and I don't have any pictures from the next stop that day, Naval Air Base Pensacola. I'm not sure, but for the sake of the story, I think this was the first appearance of the F-14 at Jacksonville and Pensacola. I can only imagine that the huge F-14 tied down amongst the Navy trainers was a major distraction. And to cap it all off, in September of 1989, number 5 made its last flight back to Pensacola to become the first F-14 on public display at the National Naval Aviation Museum, where it remains to this day. They would leave Pensacola the next day for a 2.6-hour flight to Naval Air Station Dallas, where they were greeted by Representative James Collins, Republican from Texas's 3rd District, on the tarmac soon after taxiing to be tied down. Finally, on the 12th, they left Dallas for a 4.1-hour flight to Point Magu, where my mom, brother, sister, and myself arrived late to greet my dad. A month later, he would return to Calverton to bring number 6 to Point Magu. This time, Tank Sherman would be along for the ride, and their first stop again would be Pensacola, but their second stop would not be to Dallas, but to Naval Air Station Kingsville. Like Pensacola, Kingsville is a flight training base, and for the sake of argument, this was probably another showstopper for anyone on the flight line that day. But this was just a refueling stop for the Tomcat, as it left the same day for the final leg to Point Magu. With both number 5, number 6, and eventually number 11 at Point Magu, the test program would begin in earnest. For my dad, it would be the inherently dangerous process of testing weapon separations from every hardpoint station on the plane. When not doing that, he would be preparing for the demonstration of the automatic carrier landing system for Navy acceptance. But the dog and pony aspect of those first 2 cross-country flights would continue. But why? As successful as the F-14 program was, it's easy to overlook that Grumman and the Navy had to fight for every scrap they could get to keep the Tomcat viable and funded. In the end, it was the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War that came with it that would doom the F-14. Dick Cheney, then Secretary of Defense, and the administration looked to dramatically reduce the defense budget to realize what became known as the peace dividend. Numerous programs were either canceled or had their funding considerably reduced. The F-14D, the final realization of the Tomcat's promise, would be canceled and the production line closed. Grumman's only job would be to modify existing airframes to D specs. The ironworks would be no more. That's the beginning of the end. But even in the beginning, Senator William Proxmire, best known for his Golden Fleece Awards, did his best to have the F-14 program canceled. In 1971, Proxmire called the F-14 a lemon and argued that its high cost made it an exercise in unilateral disarmament, because the Navy couldn't afford to buy enough of them. He failed where Cheney succeeded. This is a long way around to say that even within the aggressive test program at Point Magu, my dad and fellow pilots would be following a less rigorous schedule of demonstration flights that were just as important as the test flights. For my dad, that would start with his 2 cross-country flights already mentioned above. In October of 1972, he would fly chase in an F-4J for Lieutenant Jim Coleman, who was flying number 5 with Secretary of the Navy John Warner in the rear seat, on his way to commission the first 2 F-14 squadrons, the F-1 and 2, at Miramar. 2 days later, he would fly number 6 in a mock dogfight with an F-8, flown by Tony Nargi, for the Grumman fluff piece F-14 Tomcat, the total fighter. In January of 1973, he would again be flying chase for a media flight, this time for ABC's Jules Bergman, who is best known for his reporting on the space program. The following month, he would be flying chase yet again for a media flight. This time, Aviation Week's Clark Martin would be enjoying a ride in number 11 as my father played the rabbit in VX4's F-4B to demonstrate the F-14's dogfighting capability for Clark's article, F-14 Shows Dogfight Capabilities. There were other familiarization flights, and buried somewhere was a flight or 2 for beauty shots. But things had quieted down a bit with demo duties when in July of 1974, the Iranians came to town to kick the tires and drive the F-14. The Iranians had agreed to the purchase of 80 F-14s after the Shah had seen the F-14 and F-15 demo flights at Andrews Air Force Base a year before. On the 1st of July, my dad took First Lieutenant Kazim Haidarzadeh for a demo flight in Tomcat number 13. The following day, my dad sat in the rear cockpit as Haidarzadeh took the controls. The controversy of this sale came later, but at the time the contract saved Grumman and the F-14, and we'll take that story up in the next installment. The Phoenix missile system and the F-14 were never tested in combat by the U.S. Navy. They were, however, used extensively by the Iranians in their war with the Iraqis through much of the 80s, and that, along with the original acquisition of the F-14, is what we'll take up in Installment 40. So, until that time, thanks for joining me for the 39th installment of the Dad Project. I continue to tell the stories I'd hoped my father would tell me, and I appreciate y'all being along for the ride. So please subscribe if you'd like to hear more, and until next time, thanks for watching and enjoy what life has given you. Ciao.